Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I want to thank you for joining us today for a discussion of the Afghanistan quandary. Should we leave? Can we leave? So the problem of Afghanistan confounds us, as we hear every day in the media, at least on those days when there are no impeachment hearings or Iowa caucuses. It is our longest war, and we are in its 19th year. 2,300, roughly speaking, American forces have died in Afghanistan, and about 21,000 more have been wounded. Over 111,000 Afghanistans, including civilian soldiers and militants, are estimated to have been killed in a conflict that has cost the United States nearly $1 trillion. Well, based on documents recently made public by the Special Investigator for Afghanistan Reconstruction, Afghanistan may also rank as one of our most shambolic wars, incompetently executed from numerous perspectives. As the Times recently reported, Taliban attacks are at a high. In the fourth quarter of 2019, there were 8,204 attacks, which exceeded the same period levels in every year since recording began in 2010. 37% of those attacks caused casualties. A majority of the troops who were recently polled troops who have fought in Afghanistan were recently polled and thought that the war was not worth the effort. Yet at the same time, the prospect of a U.S. withdrawal carries with it all kinds of potential unwarranted consequences. The most obvious is the revival of jihadist terrorist groups who might plot attacks against the West. This might happen in Taliban-controlled areas, which still there's still more than 50% of the country is controlled by the Taliban. Or worse still, it could come after a U.S. withdrawal that opens the door to a Taliban victory and the collapse of the government in Kabul. While it has been a long time since al-Qaeda had a real sanctuary in Afghanistan, the Taliban's commitment on this score is questionable. Moreover, in recent years, we've seen the rise of ISIS in Afghanistan. Most terrorist activity has been focused within the country and the neighborhood, but the pendulum swings between the so-called near enemy, the local regime, and the far enemy, the US and its allies. And for those of us who try to assess this threat as soberly as possible, let's just stipulate that all the sobriety in the world is not going to be worth a lot if the United States Congress panics when it sees the recoalescing of a terrorist presence in Afghanistan. And finally, despite all the indices of failure in Afghanistan, there actually has been a lot that has been gained. Life expectancy is up more than 20 years since 1990, which is an extraordinary increase. Per capita GDP has more than quadrupled since 2000, even if a lot of that money represents influxes of foreign assistance. Poverty and illiteracy remain endemic, but there are millions more children in school than there were before the US invasion, and among them are millions of girls who can now go to school and get jobs, something that was out of reach under Taliban rule. Women's rights are still nowhere near where they should be, but it is a very different universe from 20 years ago. So are we going to turn our back on these advances, or can they be protected? 82% of Afghans, the Pew Foundation found, want nothing to do with the Taliban. Are we going to turn our backs on them? Well, to discuss these issues today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Barnett Rubin. Dr. Rubin, or as he is more frequently known, Barney Rubin, is a senior fellow and associate director of the Center for International Cooperation at New York University, where he directs the Afghanistan-Pakistan regional program. And he has worked at CIC since 2000. From April 2009 until October 2013, Barney Rubin was the senior advisor to the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the State Department. And if you're one of those government acronym people, I guess that means you were SOSRAP. in the office of the Special Representative, he worked first for Richard Holbrooke and later for Mark Grossman. And if you haven't read it already, I strongly recommend you have a look at George Packer's book on Holbrooke, which has some really intriguing and interesting portrayals of Barney Rubin. Holbrooke, as Packer points out, thought Barney had, quote, the merry-eyed smile of Jerry Garcia and a face like Trotsky. You haven't actually denied that, have you?
I've actually taken a poll. Put up pictures on the...
Well, you can add that into your remarks. He is the author of, by my count, at least 9 books, including most recently Afghanistan from the Cold War through the War on Terror. He has another one coming this summer entitled Afghanistan, What Everyone Needs to Know from the Oxford University Press. I'm delighted to have Barney here now because I'm hoping he will spill the beans. The hardcover list price of that book is $74 right now on Amazon, just so you know, and I would like to know what gives with that. Barney has been a special advisor to the UN on Afghanistan during the negotiations of the Bonn Agreement, which settled Afghanistan's post-Taliban governing arrangements. And he has advised the UN on the drafting of the Afghan constitution and on the country's development strategy. From 1994 to 2000, he directed the Center for Preventive Action, and was Director of Peace and Conflict Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He has taught at Columbia and at Yale, though he assures me now that he is avoiding teaching these days, and he holds a PhD, an MA from the University of Chicago, and a BA from Yale University. There is no one I like listening to more about Afghanistan, even if it is frequently a dire subject, than Barney Rubin. So I really want to thank him. I'm very grateful that he has traveled to Hanover in February. Not everyone will do that. And I hope you'll give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, first of all, that was such a shocking introduction. I had no idea they're charging $74 for that book. I hope they're putting it out simultaneously in paperback. Okay, I don't expect to sell many copies of the hardcover. Thank you for that introduction. Actually, after I left, you said no one you'd rather hear about Afghanistan. That reminds me of something. After I left the government in 2013, I had a burst of energy, and I actually wrote and recorded a rap song about my experience in the State Department. I should have, I have it on my phone here, maybe we can play it later, but at any rate, and I got, someone blurbed it, and they said, if you listen to only one rap about American policy in Afghanistan this year, yeah, etc. Now, the title of the article, of the talk is about should the U.S. withdraw, stay, or what? And in fact, as you may have noticed, during the presidential debates, the only question, really, that is asked about Afghanistan, and it's rare that any foreign policy question is asked, but it is asked, is should we withdraw our troops or not? Now, I'm sort of going to answer that question, but after Holbrooke died and he was replaced by Mark Grossman came in, and I wanted to sort of read him into everything we were doing about reaching out to the Taliban and starting negotiations, which was known to only very few people. So I wrote him an 18-page single-spaced paper on the subject, giving all the details, a background, and so on. And I never heard back from him on it. And later I heard he told other people that he wished I would tell him what time it was instead of how to make a watch. So when you ask, should we take our troops out or should we leave them there, that's like asking what time it is. Well, I'm really not going to tell you what time it is, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of what kind of a problem it is to tell what time it is. So let me go back. First, troops in Afghanistan. The first thing I want to say is I just want to say a few basic things about Afghanistan. And these are relevant not just to people, I think it's important to say this, not just because they're about Afghanistan and Afghanistan is our topic, but because there are certain basic historical facts about any country that it's necessary to take into account when thinking about how to deal with it, and which we very often do not take into account. That is, I've been struck often by when I read policy documents that they don't actually talk about the country. You know, for instance, Afghanistan is America's longest war, we say. Well, actually, it's a country. But let me say a few points about the country. First, you see it over there. The first thing you should notice about it is that it is landlocked. It doesn't have a sea coast. If it doesn't have a sea coast, by the way, that means it also doesn't have an air coast, right? In other words, you can either get to it on surface without going through another country, or by air without going through another country's airspace. Now, landlocked countries, Afghanistan, Bolivia, Rwanda, and so on, are known statistically have certain characteristics in common. They are poorer, they have slower growth rates, and all the indicators of development tend to be lower than on countries that are able to connect to international markets and so on. Now, in the case, Afghanistan being landlocked is not an accident of history, it is a design. Because again, remember that countries that exist on the map are the result of historical and political processes, not natural phenomena. And those borders that you see, not all of which are recognized by the people who live along them, were demarcated by the British and Russian empires in the late 19th and early 20th century. At that time, what is now India and Pakistan was British India, so that was Britain. What is now all those Central Asian countries was part of the Russian Empire. So Britain and Russia were approaching toward Afghanistan. And in order to avoid clashes, which had already started, they decided, they agreed on a treaty defining spheres of influence in the area. Afghanistan, they hived off part of its territory into British India, which is what made it landlocked. And it came under the British sphere of influence. That is to say, its foreign policy was controlled by Britain. It could have foreign relations only with British India and no one else. And that also determined how the infrastructure was built, infrastructure which exists to this day. That is, the main infrastructure of the country was built to connect Kabul and eastern Afghanistan to the most modern infrastructure to British India, that is to say, what is now Pakistan. Now, throughout much of history, western Afghanistan, Herat was part of the Khorasan area, which is part of the Iranian civilizational area. Northern Afghanistan belonged to the Central Asian historical area, and they had infrastructure, you know, traditionally, the traditional infrastructure known as the Silk Road, which connected all of them to each other, to China and then west. But the way that Afghanistan was built under colonialism, it cut it off from those routes and connected it primarily to British India, that is to say, what is today Pakistan. Now, it's also, Afghanistan is the poorest country in Asia. In fact, it is the poorest country in the world, except for about 5 to 8, depending on how you measure it, countries in Africa. Until recently, until those gains that Dan was talking about, Afghanistan was poorer than Haiti. In the last few years, it has edged above Haiti slightly on the UNDP rankings. Now, what does that mean? You have to think of because in order to have a state, to have institutions, you have to be able to pay for them. A country that is that poor, it's not, and you see, the problems poor countries have are not because there's something wrong with poor people. The only thing wrong with poor people is their poverty. But it means that collectively, they're not able to finance security forces and administration, build roads, and so on. So Afghanistan has an extraordinarily weak state. In 2001, when we went in there, the proportion of the GDP that was going for taxes was approximately 2%. Now it's up to about 9 or 10%, which has been an extraordinary achievement. But that's still a very low proportion of a very low income. And that means that in order to have a state in Afghanistan that can serve the needs of the war on terror, we have to subsidize it very heavily. Now, the state, and in fact, the state in Afghanistan, ever since Afghanistan was structured in this way by the British and Russian empires, has always been dependent. In fact, according to the treaty between British India and Afghanistan in the late 19th century, the British would supply the emir every year with a certain amount of cash and a certain amount of weapons. When they added the Wakhan corridor, that little bit of land coming out there on the east to Afghanistan, they added another 50% to all those figures to cover the cost of administering that area. And that is what enabled the rulers to gain control of the territory. Now, that also means this is not a state that was established through a compact among the citizens in order to promote the common good and serve the common good and promote the general welfare. It's a state that was set up to defend the borders of a foreign empire, not to provide services to its people. And that's why it's set up in such a centralized way, and it's so ineffective at many of its functions. Now, today, we are trying to have that state do many more functions, to deliver health care, deliver education, to deliver not just security for its people, but security for us. And that means we have had to spend huge amounts of money. But the fact is, spending money to build organizations by paying and training people does not create institutions in the same way that as taxing people to build institutions that they themselves are paying for and that they know they will be able to pay for in the long run. So if we take a difference between the American Army and the Afghan Army, when someone joins the American Army, they know they are joining an institution that has been around for several hundred years and that even has its own insurance company that has ads on television that you probably have all seen. The U.S. Army Association, there's a homeowners and automobile association. So they're joining an institution that will be responsible for them. People who join the Afghan Army, you're joining an institution that is dependent. Well, you may not know the detail, but they're dependent on the United States. To be specific, it's dependent on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. Okay, so how would you like the security of your country to be dependent on a subcommittee of a foreign legislature of people who don't know you? So naturally, you don't have that much confidence in what the future will bring, and rightly, because we're asking this question. Because the question is not only about our troops, but also will we continue to spend billions of dollars to support their troops? So the problem of sustainability in Afghanistan is really an extraordinary one. And we have gone in and done what we do, because that is what bureaucracies and organizations do, build the institutions we think we need to meet the needs that we define, without any regard actually for what the long-term effect on the society will be. And in fact, part of the reason that the neighbors of Afghanistan have so little confidence in what we are doing is because they know it is not sustainable. Now, often we hear a discourse in this country, at least we did before, that that's why they're hedging, because they're not sure we'll stay. So we have to show them that we are going to stay. But the fact is, we are not going to stay, and everybody knows that but us. So, or they don't believe it. So there is no way to convince them that the United States is located somewhere else. In addition, it's a landlocked country. So let me go back to what that means in terms of sending troops there. 2001, the United States decided to launch a military operation in Afghanistan, which the immediate purpose of which was to destroy the al-Qaeda bases and infrastructure that existed in the country, and to overthrow the Taliban on the grounds that those who harbor the terrorists will suffer the same fate as the terrorists themselves. We didn't have any clear idea at all about what would happen afterwards. I'll come back to that later. I was, as an outsider, a little bit part of that decision-making process. So the first problem was, how do we get there? Well, look at getting into Afghanistan. You know, it's a harder problem than landing on the beaches of Normandy, because there aren't any beaches. So basically, you have to go through Pakistan, you have to go, or Iran, or you have to go through Russia and Central Asia, which is a long way. Which means, in order to get for the United States to get to Afghanistan, it has to use supply lines whose security is dependent on either Pakistan, Iran, or Russia. So when you hear people talking about long-term presence in Afghanistan, remember that means long-term dependence on Pakistan, Iran, or Russia. It doesn't mean strategic autonomy. That's the only thing it can mean. Now, so what do we do? Well, in 2001, we were actually attacking the group that was supported by Pakistan, the Taliban. Pakistan was supporting the Taliban in order to keep India out of the area, because Taliban was the group that Pakistan could afford. You know, it wasn't very expensive, unlike the groups that we're supporting, to try to maintain some kind of order through, violence on the other side of its border and keep its enemies at bay, give it what it called strategic depth. But again, remember, Pakistan didn't have too much money either. So, again, Taliban are run without that much money. That's one of their advantages compared to the way we run things. So the first, and they were primarily concentrated in the southern and eastern areas of the country, which are inhabited mostly by the Pashtun ethnic group. And the resistance to them was concentrated in the north of the country, which borders on Central Asia, mainly among Tajiks were leading, which are Persian speakers, was leading the resistance, and some Uzbek or Turkish speakers as well. It's much more complicated than that, but this is just roughly speaking. So the first, and the core of resistance inside Afghanistan was in the Panjshir Valley, north of Kabul, which is a 100% Tajik valley. So in order to try to raise a military force against the Taliban, we had to get into Panjshir. Okay, so how do you get into Panjshir? To get into Panjshir, you have to go to Dushanbe in Tajikistan and take a helicopter. Now, Tajikistan had Russian military presence because it has had a civil war. The borders of Tajikistan were guarded by Russian border guards. So in order to get into Tajikistan, we also established a base in Uzbekistan, one in Kyrgyzstan. The United States had to negotiate with Russia. In fact, Bush negotiated directly with Putin over that. And the understanding was that they would help us go and fight our common enemy, terrorism. But the understanding was once we finished, we would leave. And that was a difficult decision for the Russians to make. But they did, and Putin helped us with those bases, getting access to northern Afghanistan. But who had access to help us on the ground? Iran. And you know who led the Iranian effort to help us? Qasem Soleimani. Because it was the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that collaborated with the CIA to establish the first CIA bases in Panjshir, Bagram Air Base, and so on. Again, because we had a common enemy. At that time also, of course, the president of Iran was Mohammad Khatami, and he was actually hoping this would help with an opening to the United States, but it ended up instead with the axis of evil in the State of the Union address a few months later. So the Iranian assistance was actually very important on the ground, and what I witnessed myself personally, the Iranian diplomatic assistance was extremely important to setting up the new government, because I was at the Bonn negotiations where the new government was set up, and I saw that the two countries that had influence with the people on the ground were the United States and Russia. The United States and Iran. And Iran actually had a little bit more influence on them politically because they really knew them. So when it came time to allocate the various portfolios in the government, and we had to keep one faction from being a bit too greedy, it was Iran that got them to step back. And the person who led that effort at Bonn talks was Javad Zarif, who's today the foreign minister of Iran, whom we have recently put under sanctions and don't even allow to come to New York for UN meetings. Now, Pakistan, of course, we gave an ultimatum, and they war gamed it and decided they didn't want to fight us. So they allowed us access through the ground, basically. And then once we were established in Afghanistan, our main supply lines, once again, used that infrastructure through Pakistan that was the result of the way Afghanistan was built at the time of British colonialism, through the port of Karachi, down there on the lower right there, up the roads through Peshawar or Quetta, and then into Kabul, which meant that we were dependent on Pakistan for our logistics. And the paradox is, if you want to escalate and send in more troops, the more troops you send into Afghanistan, the more dependent you are on Pakistan. Okay, so when people say we have to fight harder and put more pressure on Pakistan, they don't realize those two things might be contradictory because of geography, because you cannot put that much pressure on your own supply lines. And I'll give you an example of what happened. In 2011, there was a clash at the border. Now, our troops in Afghanistan constantly saw the Taliban coming in from Pakistan. They saw them getting supported by the frontier guards and so on. And so their emotions ran high. And there was an incident, probably this was an accident, where the United States bombed a Pakistani post and killed 22 Pakistani soldiers. And this led Pakistan to close, you mentioned acronyms, here comes the acronym, close the GLOCs, the ground lines of communication, which meant we could no longer supply Afghanistan through the ground through Pakistan. Now, this wasn't very public, but they didn't close the ALOCs, okay, the air lines of communication. But of course, there are certain things which are very difficult to get in by air, and it's much more expensive. So we set up the Northern Distribution Network. And the Northern Distribution Network was, again, a very expensive way of doing it, but through Russia and Central Asia down to North Afghanistan using Russian railroads and so on. Now, when Donald Trump announced the South Asia strategy in August 2017, so-called South Asia strategy for Afghanistan, a part of it was to put more pressure on Pakistan. But we couldn't put more pressure on Pakistan as we had in 2011 because we had now placed sanctions on the Russian railroads that we had been using to supply our troops through the Northern Distribution Network. And of course, as our relationship with Iran became worse and worse, we could no longer use our opening to Iran to put pressure on Pakistan as we had done in the early part of the war, 2001. Now, what happened with those troops? What are they doing? well, as I said, when they went in there, there was a clear mission as to what they were supposed to do in the first days, but there was no definition of what they would do after that. What constituted victory? Well, and of course, or success, let's say success. Well, we had what looked like a victory because we overthrew the Taliban very easily. Al-Qaeda left to Pakistan very quickly, where they still are. It was relatively stable. It was relatively stable in part because, remember, Afghanistan, this is not the beginning of the war. The war started for the Afghans in 1978. So maybe the longest war for the Americans going on 19 years, but it's much longer for Afghans. It's over 40 years. And many Afghans thought, okay, including many of the Taliban, okay, America is here, now we can end our war. And in fact, most of the Taliban leaders surrendered, or they actually reached an agreement with President Karzai the day after the Bonn Agreement. They just wanted an amnesty. But we made a choice at that time having to do with what our long-term goal was. We decided, the Bush administration decided, Cheney and Rumsfeld, that the priority was not stabilizing Afghanistan. In fact, that was not even on the agenda. It was showing that if you harbor terrorists, you will suffer the same fate as the terrorists. And therefore, the Taliban were treated the same way as Al-Qaeda, sent to Guantanamo, hunted down, and not therefore, because they were being hunted down, they could not participate in the political process that was setting up the new government. Well, for the first several years, it was remarkably peaceful. You could go walk around, you could travel around the country, and so on. But two things happened. One is the Bonn process came to an end, and that is, the Constitution was written, the presidential elections were held, the parliamentary elections were held, and by then it was clear the Taliban made several efforts actually to reach out to the government and had almost reached agreement with them in 2004, but the U.S. refused to guarantee their security. Three things. So therefore, they lost any incentive to try to cooperate and decided to launch an offensive. Pakistan felt that we had not put much diplomatic effort into the region and felt that we were operating against Pakistan's interest. I'll come back to that. And therefore allowed or encouraged the Taliban, supported them in trying to make our situation more difficult. And we signed a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan. It was signed by President Bush and President Karzai, which provided the basis, it wasn't a treaty, but seemed to indicate that we were planning on having a long-term troop presence in Afghanistan. At the same time that the insurgency was increasing. And in fact, as we had that long-term troop presence, as we started to establish what looked to everyone in the region, we never had a formal policy of having a long-term troop presence. We had a lot of people in the government that wanted it, but we never formally decided to do that. But it looked that way to everyone else. And at the same time, we have these troops there, and they're not being effective in suppressing the insurgency. They did get rid of Al-Qaeda. They provided security in urban areas and others, so a lot of things could be accomplished. But they did not succeed in enabling the government to control the territory and getting rid of the insurgency, establishing security, and so on. So therefore, you say, well, therefore we need to keep the troops there in order to prevent the government from collapsing and terrorist sanctuaries from being recreated. Well, the people in the region look at that and say, so you're saying you need to keep your troops there because they're failing. You need to keep your troops in Afghanistan because they are failing to achieve their objective. So they have to keep trying and failing forever. So what they thought is, actually, maybe they're failing on purpose because they want to keep the troops there. And keeping the troops there is the actual purpose. Now, they don't know that with any certainty, but remember, when you are planning, when you are doing defense and security planning, you plan against capabilities, not against intentions, which you cannot read. And having troops on the ground in Afghanistan gives us certain capabilities. You know, because the logistics of supplying them in Afghanistan are so difficult, I think those capabilities are exaggerated. But, you know, there are people, in Pakistan, I hear a lot of people tell me that we're in Afghanistan to contain China. I never heard anyone in China say that, but they do say that in Pakistan. Russia is concerned that we might try to use the Islamic State or something like that to destabilize Central Asia as some kind of a reprisal against Russia for what it is doing in Ukraine. There have been some speculation about that there. And in general, Iran, of course, you know, is obviously we've had people in our government who actually have advocated bombing Iran, to use force for regime change or to subvert Iran one way or another. We have intelligence operations in Afghanistan that are directed against Iran. So those countries, in addition to which, I'll add that Pakistan developed nuclear weapons, of course, which is a core interest of its defense establishment. And it did so through a program which was, in many respects, violated the international regime on non-proliferation, which we were always concerned would lead to weapons getting into the hands of terrorists. So the United States has always considered Pakistan's nuclear weapons as, to some extent, illegitimate. And the symbol of this is that the United States reached an agreement on cooperation and civilian nuclear power with India during the Clinton administration, and then augmented it during the Bush administration. Pakistan has asked for that, but the United States would never and will never give Pakistan such a civilian nuclear agreement. Therefore, Pakistan worries that at some point, and of course we always have contingency planning, what if Pakistan's nuclear weapons fell into the hands of terrorists? We might have to secure them. How would we do that? We would do that from Afghanistan, the same way that we captured Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's not as simple as capturing one person, but I've heard the two things equated. So Pakistan military thinks our being in Afghanistan gives us the capacity to go after their nuclear weapons as well, which, as we are more and more aligned with India, they're concerned we might want to do. So a consensus began growing in the region that the American troops should leave. At the same time, that there's still a consensus in the region that they do not want the state to collapse in Afghanistan. And they would prefer this government to stay in power. They don't want the U.S. to just leave and have that nightmare scenario that Dan outlined recur. But they also don't want us to be there. In other words, they will not help us stabilize Afghanistan as a military base. So now, what is the problem of getting out of Afghanistan? Of course, if we just withdrew, as Trump has toyed with that idea from time to time, without a political settlement, then first of all, that's not necessarily the most important variable, because I mentioned that it's a heavily financially dependent state as well. The Soviet Union withdrew its troops from Afghanistan in 1989. The government continued in power, the government that the Soviet Union helped set up, continued in power until 1992, for 3 more years, because during most of that period, it continued to receive food, cash, and military assistance from the Soviet Union. It was only when the Soviet Union no longer existed and all of that financial support was cut off that the government could no longer pay the troops, couldn't supply the cities with food and so on, and the government collapsed. So it might be that the flow of aid to the government is even more important than the presence of the troops. But of course, it's very difficult to keep the aid flowing politically if the troops aren't there. Nonetheless, there's a whole set of international conferences, not just the United States is involved, US, Europe, Japan, pledges of long-term assistance to Afghanistan. So that might be there. Second, the Taliban is a powerful insurgency. It is based to some extent in Pakistan. My view, which is at odds with that of many Afghans, is that it is not just a Pakistan proxy. It has certain social roots in Afghanistan as well. It doesn't represent traditional Afghanistan. It's not like that's the real Afghanistan and what we're doing. No, it doesn't, but it represents something. And one of the things it represents is a revolt against all of the clumsy things that we have done, including killing civilians and torturing people. So now we are engaged in an effort at a political settlement with the Taliban, which we rejected for most of the period that we were there. When I was in the government, my main task was to try to make the case for and try to persuade the government to try to do that, and eventually we did come around to do it. It's odd in a way that the Trump administration is willing to really invest in that more, but that's because Trump is more willing to withdraw because it seems he doesn't really care that much about what happens in the region. It wouldn't be that uncomfortable with just withdrawing. And we'll yet to see, if he's willing to, they almost reached a deal in September, and then he pulled out of it because he couldn't quite figure out how to make it look good on television. He was planning a Camp David signing, and they refused, so he stopped the whole deal. So we're close to it again. I don't know if it will work out or not. Even if they sign it, there's still a lot more to, implementing it will be very difficult. I can answer questions about how the deal is structured later if you like. And then you need some kind of consensus among, a minimal consensus, but a consensus nonetheless among the regional countries, because it's very easy to destabilize a country like Afghanistan. And if they feel that it's posing a threat to them, they will do things to destabilize it. Now that's where our current policies are really at odds with our attempt to stabilize Afghanistan. Because if we're putting maximum pressure on Iran, and Iran believes that we are now bringing maximum pressure to Afghanistan, Iran has no interest in helping us get out of Afghanistan in a stable way, even though Iran has a very strong, stronger than any other country maybe, bilateral interest in the stability of Afghanistan because of the length of their border, the relationship between their societies, and so on. Russia is concerned about American influence there, and Russia has started its own separate peace process known as the Moscow process. And if we don't follow through on our peace process, they will step in order to, with their peace process, which will rely on the political opposition to Ashraf Ghani as their main source of power in trying to get us out of the country. And a kind of consensus has grown up, and that's the basis for the Moscow process, among Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan. Now, interestingly enough, despite the fact that our policies toward Iran and Russia in particular and China are not consistent with what we would need for Afghanistan, within just the very small realm of policy on Afghanistan, and here I must give credit to Zalmay Khalilzad, who is leading these talks, he has created a diplomatic process in which US, Russia, and China have enunciated on several meetings in Washington, Beijing, and Russia a common position on Afghanistan. And they are, at this point, Russia and China are both supporting what we are doing, not disrupting it. Iran is not happy with it, but they're not actively disrupting it. The question is whether that will be sustainable given the direction of our policy. Now, in terms of American, fine, I'll get to this. Just that's looking at it in terms of the effect of troops on the region. But let's look at it another way. From the point of view of the US security posture in the world. When I hear people argue for a long-term troop presence in Afghanistan, I often hear, in fact, I heard General Votel say this when he was the commander of CENTCOM, that after all, we have had troops in Japan for a long time. We've had troops in Korea for a long time. We've had troops in Germany for a long time. Why not have them in Afghanistan? Well, besides the fact that none of those countries is a landlocked country surrounded by countries that don't want us there, Germany, we had an unconditional victory and occupied it. Japan, we had an unconditional surrender after use of nuclear weapons. In Korea, there's an armistice. So we don't have victory, surrender, or an armistice in Afghanistan. We're still taking casualties, and we never know if they might be more of them. And we're surrounded by people that don't want us there. So that's one point. Second point is, it's not 1945 anymore. In 1945, the US was producing 50% of the world GDP. Now I believe the figure is 25%. But even more relevant to Afghanistan is in Asia, the figures are more stark. When the United States went into Afghanistan in 2001, the GDP of the United States was 4 times the combined GDP of China, India, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, which is almost nothing, you know. Now, with the rise of China primarily, but also the rise of India, the American GDP is just 20% more than the combined GDP of all of those countries. That's an indication of the decline of our relative power, whatever Donald Trump said at the State of the Union message last night. He talked about our absolute power, and of course what he said, a lot of it, what he said wasn't true, but nonetheless, we do have a lot of absolute power, but our relative power is declining. And when your relative power is declining, that is not the moment when you want to expand your military footprint to areas of the world that are difficult of access. So this is, it's true that we want to try to end our operations there in a way that does not reproduce the reasons we went in there. There are ways of doing that. But it's also true that from a so-called grand strategical point of view, it doesn't really make sense for the United States at this point in its history to be expanding its military footprint into Central Asia, especially on the grounds of fighting against terrorism. Because after all, there are terrorists in a lot of different countries. We cannot have the doctrine that wherever there are terrorists, we must have permanent military bases. We have to, at some point, agree to rely on cooperation with other countries. We are just as likely to be, the attack on 9/11 was not actually planned in Afghanistan. The leader of the organization that carried it out was in Afghanistan, but it was planned in Manila, Kuala Lumpur, and Hamburg. And the pilots were trained in Florida. You know, they don't need to be in Afghanistan. There's no reason to think that Afghanistan is, you know, they could be in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, anywhere. They're unlikely to be in Iran because despite the fact that we call Iran the leading state sponsor of terror, it does not sponsor that type of terrorism. So I think that there's certainly a rationale for a negotiated withdrawal, which would involve both supporting domestic negotiations in Afghanistan and a diplomatic process, which would, of course, be a calculated risk. We can't be sure that everything would come out well. But I've got news for you. Even if we keep troops there, there's no guarantee that everything will come out well. I often I had an encounter once with Hillary Clinton at the NATO summit in Chicago in May 2012, in which I caught her on her way out of a meeting with President Zardari of Pakistan. And she knew, I've been talking to her for several years about this through Holbrooke and so on. She said, I understand why you think that political settlement is so important in Afghanistan. She said, but I'm just skeptical that it will work. So I said, well, your skepticism is well-founded. But you should be equally skeptical that the military strategies will work. And you know what she said? She said, duh. And that is also, I think, the reaction of many people who are well acquainted with our operation in Afghanistan to the revelations in the Afghanistan papers. They're not really very surprising. The question is, are we going to keep on doing something over and over again just because we're failing at doing it? I don't think that's a good choice. Thank you. Thank you.
Should we go over there?
Okay.
Oh, I think you're over here. You're over there.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, makes one optimistic about the world. I wanted to ask you, and it's very much in line with your final remarks. Having watched the U.S. military in Afghanistan, it's been said that we didn't fight one war for 19 years. We fought 19 wars, each for 1 year. Or there have been variations on that one. And I'm curious if you would agree with that estimate, that we might have had a better outcome if we hadn't rotated officers and troops as much as we had, if we had actually acquired real local knowledge. I'm curious what your evaluation, I'm guessing you think that we weren't going to get it right no matter what, but I'm curious in what way you think that is the truth.
Well, one time I was talking to Doug Lute at the White House, who was, I think this was in the Bush administration, so he was the Iraq-Afghanistan war czar instead of the Afghanistan-Pakistan war czar. And he told me they were developing a tool, a web-based tool that would have all the tribes and ethnic groups of Afghanistan on it and where they're located and so on, so that when a military unit went into a region, they could just log on and they would have situational awareness. They would know who was there. So my reaction to that is any strategy that requires the United States Army to understand Afghan tribal politics is a strategy that will fail. And that is because you can't understand that. It's not a matter of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4. You can't understand it without like devoting your life to it or being there. I wouldn't claim that I understand it, and it's kind of knowledge that only the local people can have. And why should I don't really even know if it's a criticism. Okay, the United States government doesn't know much about Afghanistan, doesn't understand Afghanistan. Really, why should it? Why would you expect it to? There's nothing in the Constitution about building up capacities for understanding Afghanistan. It can't. So that's why we ought to conduct foreign relations in a different way. That's why it's a good idea to be more restrained in certain respects. So I was involved with. I'm not against the whole policy of peace building. I was involved in it and so on, but I think that in a way the danger we found is, actually it's what John Quincy Adams said, going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. If you look for monsters, you will find them, but sometimes it turns out, but they're not all the same, even if they appear to be monsters to you. So Taliban and Al-Qaeda are not the same. We could have dealt with them quite differently, but we didn't, but for various reasons, some understandable, some less so, we did not. But, now, in addition to which, you talked about the military. It's not primarily a military struggle, in my view, because if you think, what is it actually on the ground? It's control. It's not control of territory is a way of measuring it, but actually it's control of population and of assets, and the use of force can have only a limited effect on that. You have to have the infrastructure, the knowledge, the ability to punish and reward and so on that you get from being a functioning state. In other words, it's the side that administers the best and governs the best that is most likely to win. All that the military operation can do is give you the chance to try to do that, but it can't enable you to succeed. And that's where we've had the most difficulty.
So if you were advising the Bush administration in December of 2001.
I was. I wasn't. Yeah.
Well, we won't rub it in.
I don't say they took my advice.
Yeah. So what would you have said should be the plan? Because, as we all know, we went in and we lost bin Laden at Tora Bora. We settled into an occupation and immediately started spending our time. And I don't mean we, because I thought this was a stupid idea, but getting ready to invade Iraq. Completely took our eye off the ball. Let's just stipulate that we would not have gone after Iraq, which had no connection with al-Qaeda, et cetera, and I'm pretty sure that was where you were, but what would you have told them about what was achievable and what should the metrics be and when and how long should we be there?
I can show you a video of the moment when we ruined everything. It's a video of
can you attach that to the rap song?
I should actually. And I'm realizing talking to you that I should carry around that video with me. It's a video of Donald Rumsfeld giving a press availability at the Pentagon on December 7th, 2001. And he's being asked questions by reporters about these reports that the Taliban and the new government, the 2-day-old government in Afghanistan, have arrived at an agreement, which was true. That is, Hamid Karzai, who was there at the time, had reached an agreement with Mullah Omar and the leadership of the Taliban that the Taliban would hand over the remaining 4 provinces that they controlled without a fight in return for amnesty and being able to live in dignity and safety. That was pretty much all there was to it. Unfortunately, no text has survived, so we can't prove this. It's just people's memory. But I've interviewed people who were in those meetings, and both Karzai and people who were on the Taliban side at the time, and it seems pretty well confirmed. And the reports were coming out at that time. And Rumsfeld said, well, this isn't confirmed. We don't know. Anyway, he said, we're not going to have a negotiated settlement. I think our policy is clear. So they actually undermined Karzai. They supported another warlord there to take over Kandahar, and they started sending the people to Guantanamo. So it meant that we, I won't tell you a lot of, I'm being flooded with memories of what happened to different leaders here and there, but I won't tell you all of that. But, we didn't have to send the Taliban to Guantanamo and treat them the same way as al-Qaeda. They had stopped fighting us. They weren't fighting us. They didn't think they could defeat the United States. They maybe have changed their minds, but at that time they didn't think they could defeat the United States. It was an opening. They didn't know what kind of system would be there. There was a process that they could have participated in. But instead, we actually gave them no chance but to flee to Pakistan and fight. So that was the biggest.
So your advice would have been, let's count this as a victory and we'll go home soon.
Yes, first of all, we would never have needed such a large footprint if we had supported a political settlement. Now, of course, who knows if it would have lasted, if it would have worked, and so on. But I think there was a consensus, even among most Taliban at that time. They didn't want al-Qaeda back. It was against their religion to arrest them and turn them over to us, but it's not against their religion to tell them to stay out. At that time, al-Qaeda basically had destroyed what the Taliban had done, and they knew it. And most of the leadership, from what I've been able to glean, did not agree with Mullah Omar's decision. So there was not like, nobody in the Taliban was saying, no, we have to bring back al-Qaeda. They didn't want al-Qaeda to come back. They wanted to live safely in their Afghanistan.
So you know the Taliban as well as pretty much anyone in the United States. And you had some of the initial conversations with them. Do you think that the path that has been laid out of a U.S.-Taliban agreement followed by a Taliban-Afghan government negotiation has a shot at working and preserving those things that we think are critical? That is to say, the absence of terrorists, the preservation of a democratic government, and a basic human rights there?
Well, first of all, the biggest threat to all of those things is not a political settlement or the withdrawal. The biggest threat is, because Afghanistan had all those things before the Taliban even existed. The biggest threat is that the country is so poor and so weak institutionally, and is surrounded by countries that are at odds with each other. So that's why a negotiation process of some type and international support is necessary. As far as the way the process is structured, the fact is it's not the way I would like to structure it, but it's the only way that it's possible to structure it. Because, as they say in the military, the enemy gets a vote. And the Taliban position is that they will not talk to the Afghan government until they reach an agreement with the United States on the troop withdrawal. So it would be much better if the Afghan government was directly involved in the talks now. But the choice we actually have is between having them structured the way they are now or having no talks. So I think this is better. Now, as far as preserving the gains that have been obtained by at least portions of the population, again, I'll give you right now. One of the things that's happened is there's a pretty good university that we've established, the American University of Afghanistan, and the Taliban attacked it viciously and killed some of the students a couple of years ago. I just talked to a woman who was studying there at the time. She just sent me a paper she wrote, and you know, she has nightmares and so on about it. And now the school might be closing, but it's not in danger of closing because the Taliban attacked it and there's a lack of security. It's in danger of closing because the U.S. Congress seems to want to cut off its funding. So the same thing is true of many things. That we could, you know, now girls and boys can both go to school in Afghanistan, but we're paying for those schools. So same for healthcare, because the country is just so poor. So if we, of course, they are paying for some of those things because we are paying for the security by and large. So the biggest danger is withdrawal of the financial assistance that the country needs. Now, in terms of maintaining all of those things, it will be difficult. I don't know. Well, first, they're not all quite as wonderful as we say now, but you know, I don't know that there's a way to guarantee them because they're built on things that by their nature are not going to be permanent. But it is also true that there have been permanent changes in Afghan society as a result, not only of our aid money, but 40 years of war. But one of the things that our presence has actually accomplished has been the expansion of education and of telecommunications. And it is really remarkable to see the younger generation that is educated now. Remember that it's been a generation, like 20 years, right? So there are kids who were in elementary school when we went in who are now graduating from major universities all over the world and are quite skilled. So the kind of skills gap that was there when we went in is not as serious anymore. And it's a connected country. You may remember under the Taliban and before the Taliban, under the Mujahideen group, under the Mujahideen rule, you know, it was very hard to get any information about what was going on there. People would go in underground and take videos and then sneak them out, and then a couple weeks later you would hear something. But now, of course, you've got millions of cell phones connected to the internet, so anything happens, you see a picture of it immediately. In fact, there have been charges that Russia has charged, for instance, that the United States or somebody is taking ISIS fighters from Syria and flying them into Afghanistan by helicopter. So I asked the foreign minister of Afghanistan about that. He said, well, they come to us and tell us this, but we just say to them, everybody in this country has a cell phone with a photograph. Bring us a photo of one of these helicopters. And so far they haven't. Although when I said that to the Russians, they said, if you want a picture of a helicopter, I'll bring you a picture of a helicopter. So that doesn't mean that everything will work out, because we have seen in many countries that when a younger generation becomes educated and skilled, but the employment opportunities are not available for them, they may become radicalized. There will be emigration. So it's unpredictable. But given the indicators, just if you're a social scientist, you just look at the indicators in Afghanistan, you'll say, well, there's no way this country is going to be actually stable. But it does not have to be a threat to international peace and security. It doesn't have to be a country where 5,000 or 10,000, however many it is, soldiers lose their lives every year.
So the image you're conjuring in my mind is the last couple of scenes of Charlie Wilson's War, where it's fundamentally about whether we're going to be there for Afghanistan in terms of providing the financial wherewithal to keep this thing rolling for a while.
Yes, I mean, you mean the scenes where he's talking about building schools and so on. Yeah, not just the schools, but also the state. Now, they do have, the current government does have a plan to make Afghanistan self-sufficient. But of course that plan it won't fail, but it won't work either, like most plans. And it's going to require aid for quite some time. And it requires a lot of political work because, again, as a landlocked country, to develop its economy, it has to reach markets, which means it has to develop what is called connectivity. And this is the region of the world with the least amount of intra-regional trade and the worst indices on connectivity. So there are major efforts underway now, like the Chinese Belt and Road, which we have some objections to, Indian and Iranian attempts to build ports that will link India to Iran and then to Central Asia and Afghanistan and so on, which are very important, but that requires not just money, but a lot of diplomatic effort in order to get the agreements that you need. Now, I don't know that the United States is the right country to make that diplomatic effort, but I would say, unfortunately, the emphasis that the Trump administration now has on promoting rather than trying to mitigate great power competition is liable to make that more difficult.
That's a perfect segue for my last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, which is that if you're looking at the region, wouldn't you have to guess that the circumstances for us to remain in the country are becoming ever more difficult, because I think the Iranians now have a lot more incentive to make our life difficult there. The Chinese are probably happy to make our life more difficult there. Pakistan's never made our life easy there. I think of the neighborhood as becoming even less hospitable than it has been in an inhospitable past.
Well, you're a counter-terrorist guy, so you're thinking in terms of security. I used to do political economy, so let me put it another way. Because of the expansion of the Chinese and Indian economy, those countries now have a greater interest in producing the public good of regional security than they did before. China, in the last few years, its policy in Afghanistan has changed remarkably from being passive and out of it to being involved with the peace process, trying to host some meetings, cooperating with the United States on the peace process, and so on. And if you think about it, it didn't do anything like that when the Soviets left. In 1989, when the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, I don't know if any of you have been to Shanghai, but Shanghai's on a river, and on one side of the river, at that time, it was farmland. And now it's Pudan, which is the financial center of Asia. It's used in films when they want to show some place that's postmodernistic. And so that's a completely different China with a different definition of its national interest. In addition to which, China is, of course, concerned about Xinjiang in western China and the Uyghurs there, and has developed this terrible surveillance regime and camps and so on. But because of that, it is also trying to develop a presence in northeastern Afghanistan in Badakhshan province, and believes that so China now believes that the stability of Afghanistan is necessary for the domestic stability of China, which puts it in a different way. And I could tell a similar story for many of the countries in the region.
I wish I were a political economy person instead of the gloomy security guy that I am. So why don't we open it up? Nelson, sure. Wait, just wait for the mic. We want you to be recorded for posterity.
Thanks. Great talk. Stuff I read suggests that the current Taliban leadership is far more pragmatic than Mullah Omar and the circle around him. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that says, let the Taliban win, and women's education will go down the drain. Lots of things will go back to being more fundamental. So there is this complicated way that people who aren't familiar with the region have to understand what the Taliban intends to do. And then a second related issue is it seems as if the Taliban is much more organized, much more effective in winning district after district. And so if you would assess how successful they are and whether it's just a question of time before they take over. Let me push it as hard as I can so you can respond. So those two questions.
Well, those are related questions. First, the Taliban leadership is not composed of radically different people, but you know, if you fight the United States for 20 years and come out and survive, you have to learn something going through that process. And the Taliban leadership originally was an extremely parochial group. Mullah Omar had never been outside of southern Afghanistan, except when he went to a hospital in Pakistan once. He never spent the night in Kabul. He went there for a day once and came back. Now, you know, they have millions of refugees. They learn English in Pakistan. They have offices around the world. And they use telecommunications as part of their war making, and they're very skillful in using telecommunications and the internet for propaganda purposes and so on, rather than being the people who used to blow up televisions and tape. And that's not because they've become more liberal. They haven't become liberal, but they've become more sophisticated, and they've learned about other alternatives. So the fact is, when you say this is a problem I have, I believe that Taliban have changed. That doesn't mean I believe they've become liberal. If they've changed, it doesn't mean that maybe they haven't become better or they've become like us. No, but they have changed in their own way, and they're much more pragmatic. Now, in particular, what they learned, and this has to do with the question of will they win. They learned that if you want to rule Afghanistan, you need foreign support. It is really not worth trying to take over Afghanistan if the whole world is against you, or if only Pakistan is for you, which isn't worth that much, because they may be able to, they can take over rural districts, but they cannot run a power grid. They don't know how to manage their foreign relations. They can fight, but they can't manage a modern army or an air force or something like that. And they don't know how to run an economy. And now they know they don't know how to run an economy. And I went to Kandahar for the UN in 1998, and I asked to visit the offices of the local development bank, the Bank Milli Afghanistan, which is the National Development Bank. So I went in, there were three guys there drinking tea. One young guy, he was the head of it, and he said, I have no qualification. So he described what they're doing economically. He said the prices in the bazaar were too high, and most of the stuff is imported from Pakistan. So we decreed a change in the exchange rate of the rupee. But then suddenly, nobody was importing anything. So it didn't work. He was puzzled. Anyway, so they know that they have a lot to learn about those things. So that is why they have put so much emphasis on winning international recognition as part of their strategy. That's why they wanted these confidence-building measures with the United States. And that, because then that is one respect, that indicates that they are not global jihadists in the sense of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, because they're not interested in winning international recognition. They're interested in overturning the current international system. The Taliban, of course, the Taliban want to operate within the state structure of Afghanistan, even if they would like to structure it in ways that we would find deeply disturbing. And that has, and practically that means that that's why they want to work with others, because not because they've become more liberal or accommodating, but because they've become pragmatic. They have come to understand that in the world as it actually exists, to get the assistance that they need to do the things that they feel are necessary, they need to reach an understanding with the outside world.
Thank you. Your comments about the economy were fascinating, the comparison of the GDP, the fact that China and India perhaps are the most able to fill in financially. What would happen if we did reduce all of our troops, pulled all of our troops out, and I think in the current thinking in the U.S., that would also carry with it a withdrawal of all of our financial support. Who would fill the vacuum, and what would happen if the vacuum was not filled?
Well, if we just withdraw all our troops and all our financial support, which is not something that I recommend or support, then, I mean, Ashraf Ghani, the president of the country himself, has said that without the financial support, the government would collapse. He said within 6 months, which is probably optimistic. You know, so and they would go back to fighting. Even nobody would want to, but they wouldn't have any choice, actually. But each other, yes. And then all the neighboring countries would get involved because they would feel they have to prevent their enemies from taking power and so on. You know, because just when you have a situation of shortage and people are desperate, they have to each group bands together to try to, you know, provide its own security, self-provision, I believe it is known as in international, and you get an anarchic type of situation. So that would be very dangerous. So that's why I say, that's why I don't, to pose the question, it goes back to the way I started the talk, as it is posed in these TV debates as should we withdraw our troops or not, is to oversimplify the question, and I'm not just saying that as an academic who likes to write long papers, though I am an academic who likes to write long papers, but because you know, your military strategy has to be integrated into your political and economic strategy, or it will not have the effects that you hope for.
I will consult you the next time I invite you for a better title, although you did say that's as good as, any.
It's perfect, because it enables me to talk about that.
Hey, I have more of a question with regards to Central Asia than it is with Pakistan. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on because my understanding is that those countries have brutal dictatorships, and because of that, there's a bunch of like radical jihadist networks that are also operating on that side of the border, just like they're operating on in the sides of Pakistan, like the Taliban and stuff. So how do you see, if there was a reconciliation process, how do you foresee that those groups would not use the Afghan territory to, you know, to further their agenda and stuff?
Well, in the days after the Uzbekistan became independent, there did develop an Islamic movement, particularly in a part of the country called the Fergana Valley, which was quite violently repressed by the government of Islam Karimov. Also in Tajikistan, which had certain similarities to Afghanistan, in that Tajikistan was the poorest Soviet republic, and it was dependent on subsidies from Moscow. So when those subsidies from Moscow disappeared, it actually collapsed into factional fighting, and one of the factions took on more of an Islamic coloring. And they fled into northern Afghanistan at that time, and had some support from Iran as well. So the Islamists from Tajikistan actually went back and were integrated through a political settlement. The Islamists from Uzbekistan Many of them ended up in Pakistan, in the tribal territories, where they were co-located with Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and so on. Of course, it's very difficult to get. I haven't done any of this research myself. I'm repeating to you things that I read or that other people have told me, so I'm not sure how reliable this is, but it appears that some of them were pushed out by the Pakistan Army when it had an offensive in that region, under heavy Chinese pressure, by the way, called Zarb-e-Azm, because there were Chinese Uyghurs in that area as well, and they were pushed out into Afghanistan. Many of them went to northern Afghanistan, where there are also Uzbek-speaking people. Some of them, and some other Central Asians, have apparently also gone to Iraq and Syria. And there are wildly different estimates about the numbers of them. And then some of them have come back and established themselves in North Afghanistan. So if you ask the Russians, they will say 5,000. If you ask some other people, they will say 200. I have no idea what the truth might be. I'd be more inclined toward 200 than 5,000, but you know, I don't have any actual evidence. So there is such a problem. Russia is concerned that, since, as Russia says, between Afghanistan and Moscow, there are no real borders, they say. The Central Asian countries don't like to hear that, but that's what the Russians say. So they're concerned that that could lead to destabilization of Russia. So, of course, Russia is very vulnerable because of the huge number of workers that it has, migrant workers that are coming there from Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. If you stay in a hotel in Moscow, you will notice that all the staff are from Central Asia, all the menial staff are from Central Asia. And there have been some reports of radicalization among those migrants. I don't know if it's true, but it's true of some of the diasporas in Europe, actually, as well. So it could be, it's possible. So they are concerned about that. However, one of the elements of the agreement that has been drafted between the United States and the Taliban is not only do the Taliban agree by name not to allow Al-Qaeda to use Afghanistan, but they agree to continue to fight against the Islamic State. And they have been fighting against the Islamic State relatively successfully in some areas. And there's even talk of setting up some coordination mechanism for the fight against the Islamic State. And if the Islamic State has been able to anchor itself in Afghanistan because of the weaknesses of state sovereignty, which have been reinforced by the existence of the insurgency. If the insurgency is reduced and the government is able to extend its control more uniformly, and it has a common interest in fighting against Al-Qaeda, it will probably be better able to control the Islamic State as well. As far as within Central Asia itself, I was in Uzbekistan recently. I was there as an election monitor. I went to Russia after that, and they asked me were the elections in Uzbekistan free and fair. I said, well, they were fair. But things are loosening up a little bit there slowly. But really, there hasn't been any terrorist incidents in those countries in quite a long time, and it does not appear to be. I mean, vigilance is always called for, but it does not seem to be a major problem at the moment.
One more question. Back here.
Hi, thanks for your
We'll
talk.
get two in. Two quick ones.
Wanted to ask you about the 2012 surge in Afghanistan. It seemed like the U.S. was using similar tactics and strategies what we tried in Iraq. And in Iraq, it seemed pretty effective at suppressing violence, at least in the short term. But Afghanistan wasn't really the case. You know, Obama spent a long time consulting lots of people, maybe over 6, 8, 10 months before deciding to surge. What's your read on the first draft of history on why that was largely unsuccessful?
Well, I don't know, this might sound a little arrogant, but I have had the occasion to discuss this with General Petraeus.
I thought this was coming.
And I have the impression that General Petraeus doesn't understand what happened in Iraq, because he thinks it was a success of counterinsurgency. What happened was we allied with the Sunni tribes against Al-Qaeda which enabled them to protect themselves from the Shia-dominated government that we had installed. So it was we found political allies based on the politics of Iraq. And Iraq, of course, it has oil and is able to fund its state, although with considerable problems. And there was just, in Afghanistan, there simply was the basic problem of funding the state. And sending more troops to protect the population doesn't work when the basic institutions of administration are just not working. There are other things as well, but I think it was basically a political problem, and the rote application of the counterinsurgency handbook to Iraq or Afghanistan is not a formula for success.
I thought you were going to say it was because Petraeus was appointed to the CIA and wasn't around to claim credit. But we'll hold that for another time. So we had one other quick question. Yes.
Yeah. He still claims credit for the success. You can see his comments.
Yes.
Yeah, the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan has been a wild place ever since the Durand Line was put in. Pakistan also has another border to its east with India, and I remember reading this is a few years ago, that India has been giving some, quote, aid, unquote, to Afghanistan, rebuilding government buildings and so forth. Is this just India's stirring the pot a little bit to bother the Pakistanis, or is it do they have more serious thoughts there? I haven't followed this up recently. But.
Do you still have a clearance?
I do.
I don't, so maybe he should answer that question. I'll give the unclassified answer.
Okay, you give the unclassified answer, yes.
Well, just for anecdotally, I've crossed both of those borders, by the way. In fact, very recently I crossed the border from Pakistan into India at Wagah, which is quite a spectacle.
Did you see the dancing troops, marching troops?
I wanted to, but I might have missed my plane to Delhi if I'd done that. So I saw them setting up for it, but I didn't see the actual thing. Look, there's a long history of Afghanistan-based support for Baluch insurgencies and for Pashtun nationalism in Pakistan. That was not always been by India. Russia and Iraq were doing it at one time. I mean, Soviet Union and Iraq were doing it at one time. There is, as far as I know, India has given some support to the Baluch, but mostly from what I was able to glean, it was like they put some stuff in their bank accounts in Dubai. It was not a major operation. When I was in the government, Pakistan was giving us information saying that India, there's this camp here, there's this and that. And we would look and we find soccer fields and, never found it. Recently, I'm told by people who are reading current intelligence that there is more, of course, today's India is a little bit different, and that in recent years, India has become a bit more active with doing some things to Pakistan. So it would be surprising, and India is, by the way, playing a really generally positive role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan and has good programs there. But they also have been surprisingly interested in building roads right up to the border with Pakistan and having people there, which is the only sensible thing for them to do. And on the other hand, Pakistan, some people in Pakistan greatly exaggerates the role of India in creating their internal problems in ways that are, frankly, not credible. But that doesn't mean India is innocent.
Okay, it's a great place to stop. I want to thank Barney Rubin for joining us today for an incredibly enlightening talk. And somehow you've left me slightly optimistic, which is more than I was when I began. And that doesn't happen here often. So anyway, thank you very much.